Hey guys, welcome back. I've been away for a little while and I have done a lot of reading while I was away. So I've got 4 new books that I finished reading and I want to share them with you. Before we get started, I want to let you know that I'll leave links to all the books that I mentioned today in the description box below. When you shop my links, it helps support my channel and is greatly appreciated. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's dive right in. The first book that I've read recently is Mao's Last Dancer by Lee Kun-zin. How has it taken me so long to read this book? I have no idea. It's been on my mental list to read for the longest time, and I was in the library the other day and I finally saw it sitting there like a beacon of hope on the shelf. So I snatched it right up and I borrowed it. Oh my goodness, what an amazing book. This book absolutely deserves all of the praise and the publicity that it gets. I know that it's been around for a while, so I'm a little bit late to the party, but it's just fantastic and I think it was well worth the wait. This book is an autobiography of Lee Kun-zin's life. He was born in China in the late 60s under Mao's dictatorship and recounts his story as a childhood when he was living in pretty much extreme poverty, and how he basically was chosen one day at his school out of millions of other children to be taken into Madame Mao's ballet academy, and how from there he had a very successful career as a male ballet dancer. It was really interesting to hear Lee talk about his perception of Western countries, particularly because he was influenced so much by Mao's dictatorship and, I guess, censoring of Western influences at the time. He believed that all Western countries were very bad and terrible, and that there was so much more peace and prosperity within China at the time, when of course we know now that that definitely wasn't the case. And he talks a lot about how when he first went to America in his early 20s to dance at the Houston Ballet Academy, how he was completely shocked at the prosperity and the wealth and the happiness that the Americans had, and how he started to question, hang on, I've been told that America is a really bad place, and yet everyone here seems so much happier and more well-fed than my home in China. The juxtaposition between his two worlds was really, really interesting for me to read. As an ex-ballet dancer myself, I also understand a lot of, I guess, a little bit of technical aspects that Lee was talking about when he was training. I can definitely appreciate how difficult some of the steps that he eventually mastered are, and I think that gives me an extra reverence or respect for him, because I know how difficult ballet is to learn, and the fact that he was originally a young child who didn't have any interest in it at all to then become one of the prime dancers of a ballet company, I think is quite extraordinary and really amazing. Lee eventually decided to defect from China and move to America, which in itself was quite a stressful time for him. And the whole story of his life is just simply incredible. If you haven't read this book already, please do. You'll learn so much. I absolutely loved it, and I'm glad that I finally got to read it. The next book I've read recently is Every Cripple a Superhero by Christoph Keller. This book was in my previous TBR video from a few weeks ago, and I read it and I absolutely loved it. As a person who works as a disability support worker, this one touched a special place in my heart. Christoph was born with spinal muscular atrophy, which is a condition which you have for your entire life. And it basically means that over time he lost the ability to use his muscles, which meant that as a young boy he was able to walk and move around relatively easily, but as the years went on he became more and more reliant on a wheelchair until eventually he wasn't able to stand up from the wheelchair anymore. I think one of the most difficult things for Christoph, and of course this is just my personal assumption, is that he still has his full cognitive ability. His mind is in perfect working order. It's just his body that is failing, and I feel like that's the toughest thing to try and live with, is the fact that you know exactly what's going on, you know exactly what you can and can't do, but there's nothing you can do about it. And Christoph does seem to take a lot of things in his stride, but of course everyone has their limits, and Christoph shared a number of stories throughout his life of moments where, being in a wheelchair, he's experienced just blatant discrimination basically. He talks about how people react to him because he's in a wheelchair, how people quite clearly show their disinterest or their almost disgust towards him, as if they want to say, why can't you just stand up, as if that's a brilliant idea that he hasn't thought of. And just all these moments that to someone who doesn't require a wheelchair to move around, you don't even think about, but for him small things like stairs or steep ramps or gutters can be a real challenge. And it really provided me with a different perspective on life and how different people live their life and what they need to deal with on a daily basis. Christoph quite ingeniously went around New York City and took photos of all these little divots and gutters and I guess like ramps that are too steep at the edge of a curb that present a challenge to him when he's trying to get around. And the day that he decided to go out and take these photos, the night before it had actually rained, and so he was essentially taking photos of puddles but in these puddles you could see all the buildings of New York reflected back at you. And the photos ended up being so beautiful because on one hand they were these beautiful mirror pool reflections of all these buildings around, and that created such a beautiful image. But the pictures also had this second layer because they were all parts of the sidewalk or the curb that Christoph had difficulty getting over in his wheelchair. And so on one hand they're very beautiful, but on the other they're also quite sinister in a way, and they were just such thought-provoking images. There was one photo that really stood out to me where it basically looked like some dirt or some fresh concrete where a car had driven through it. So there was like this divot in this concrete that would have otherwise been flat. And it's something that someone who doesn't need a wheelchair will just simply step over, no worries, and just keep going on with their life. But for Christoph, it posed a real challenge, and it's just this extra layer of seeing the world that I never thought of before, and I'm so glad that Christoph shared it in his book. Please get your hands on this book if you can. It's an absolute eye-opener and such a joy to read. The next book I've read recently is Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. I finally did it! I read this fiction book. If you watched my previous TBR video, you'll know that this book has been on my list for a while, and I need to be in a proper mood to read fiction. As you've seen from my channel, I'm a non-fiction reader 99% of the time. Every now and then I get this little voice in my ear that says, Jasmine, you've been reading so much non-fiction so far. Let's try a fiction book, something new, something fresh, just to change it up. And a little voice definitely spoke in my ear the other week, and so I finally read this one. Oh my god, what a ride. Oh, this book was like a mind bender. There's definitely a reason why Gone Girl is as successful as it is, and I think it's actually already been turned into a movie as well. It's basically just like a psychological thriller the whole way through, and the premise is that this woman goes missing, of course, and her husband tries to find her, but then you learn all these other things that happen, and in the end she wasn't as innocent as she first seems. And I don't want to give it away for you, but basically like 2 or 3 days afterwards I was just like, what did I just read? Is anything real? I don't know what's going on anymore. It was just so good, so intense, but so good. And the ending, I was just like, how can this happen? How can this happen? Even though it's a fiction book, how can this story end this way? And I think Gillian did such an incredible job of setting up the characters. You really get an understanding of why they act the way they act throughout the book because of all the backstory and their upbringing and their childhood. And I don't think I've ever come across any other author who sets up her fictional characters quite as well as Gillian had. And that makes for a really intense, beautiful story because the characters can act a little bit wacky and crazy, but you still think to yourself, oh yeah, no, that's right for that character. That makes sense. And yeah, it's just such a good book. So I just realized that my microphone has been in the wrong place this whole time. Sorry, the audio should sound better now. So the fourth book that I've read recently is The Chronology of Water by Lydia Yuknovich. This book is a wild ride, I tell you what. I again just found it in the library, and initially when I picked it up, I read the bio and something about the front cover just made me feel like it was going to be kind of like an ethereal autobiography of a woman finding herself, and nothing too hard or heavy. Just like another nice, light autobiography of a woman's life. And it definitely was not quite nice and light. At least not as much as I thought. Lydia has had one hell of a life. Her way of writing is just absolutely beautiful. She has such a way of implying things that have happened without explicitly saying them, which, considering what has happened to her in the past, I think is a really nice way to show without telling in a way, even though it's a book. Her writing is still quite explicit at some points, and the words that she uses in particular are, I guess, very to the point. Even though I just said that she kind of dances around a few topics, there are other points where I was just like, whoa, that's a word that I read, or that's a sentence, and there it is. So I wouldn't recommend this book if you're a bit faint of heart, but I think her story is just absolutely incredible either way. She basically grew up in an abusive family, but because she was an excellent swimmer, she ended up getting a scholarship to go to college. She talks about her addiction to drugs and alcohol. She talks about some of her sexual escapades, and she talks a lot about her 3 husbands, 2 ex-husbands and a current husband, and her relationships. She talks about a miscarriage that she's had and a whole bunch of other things. And you really just get the impression that she is a very strong woman. She has been through a lot, and the way that she writes about these experiences is truly just a joy to read, even though the subject matter may not be that nice. Yeah, her perception of it all and the way that she tells her story is just simply an absolute joy. And even though this book wasn't exactly what I was expecting when I first picked it up, I'm so glad that I read it. I really am. It's so eye-opening and interesting, and similar to Christoph's Keller book, it was just a completely different life from mine, and I got to learn about it, and that's really what I'm after when I read autobiographies. That wraps up this video of the 4 books that I've read recently. I've actually already started another 3 books. Oh my goodness, I went to the library again recently and I picked up a whole bunch of new books, and I've started a whole bunch because I want to read all of them at once. So I think I'll have another TBR ready soon, just to go through all the books that I still have to read, and maybe even another video of a few books that I've read, because I am on a reading roll at the moment. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. As mentioned earlier, I'll leave links to all the books that I mentioned today in the description box below, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye bye.